Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers from Fiji to Turkey in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. My name is Jose, and I'd like to thank you all for joining me again today in this productivity talk organized by the Asian Productivity Organization. Today's P-Talk topic is designing regulatory regimes to improve productivity. Regulations are essential tools for governments to promote productivity, thereby enhancing the well-being of society. However, they should be carefully designed and regularly reviewed if their potential is to be realized. The APO previously commissioned a toolkit that explored the management systems required at the national level to develop and maintain an effective stack of regulations. The APO publication on the Regulatory Policy Toolkit to improve productivity, authored by Mr. Derek Gill, provides an analysis of an individual regulatory regime rather than at the total system level, which we will explore in this P-Talk. Joining us in this P-Talk is the author himself, the Adjunct Scholar, Mr. Derek Gill, from the Victoria University of Wellington School of Government, New Zealand. A warm welcome to you, Sir Derek. How are you? And would you like to say hello to our viewers, sir?
Kia ora, very nice to be here. Nice to partner with the APO and very nice to work with you again, Jose.
Thank you very much, sir, for joining us in this P-Talk. And basically, we will promote your work with the APO through this toolkit. So our viewers are encouraged to send questions or comments via the chat box, since we are live at the end of each stage of the process, as well as the general Q&A session later. So we hope to ask your questions directly to the author, Mr. Derek Gill. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation with Sir Derek, as I always call him. So sir, with this toolkit, so my first question to you is, what was the purpose of developing this regulatory toolkit, and why was it developed in the first place?
Thanks. That's a really good question. In regulatory policy, you've got lots of choices. And so the little picture on the slide just reminds you about if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, whereas on the right-hand side is a picture of a real toolkit if you're a serious woodworker. And it shows that you've got lots and lots of options. And regulatory policy is like that. You've got lots and lots of options, lots of permutations and combinations. And a good example from my own experience is working on occupational regulation. So there's a little continuum there. I won't go through them all, but starting at the top is just you can just rely on the general framework of the law, no specific rules. And an example from that from New Zealand, where I live, is the way we regulate economists. And there's a continuum down there. There's negative licensing, where anyone can practice unless it's precluded. And then at the very bottom, you've got explicit licensing, where you've got registration and its practice is limited to those on an official register. So there's a spectrum there, and you obviously don't want to default to licensing, full licensing, if say negative licensing, or indeed the general framework of laws will work. So just being conscious of the choices and being more deliberative in your decision making. But yeah, hopefully that gives you a sense, Jose.
All right, sir. Thank you very much for using this very good example in analyzing regulation with occupational regulation as an example. So, sir, I understand in this toolkit we have developed you have proposed to observe certain processes in designing this regulation. So, my question to you is that where do we start in this process or in these stages?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So the way the toolkit's organized is a sort of a structured process that steps you through. So you start in the middle of that diagram and the kind of plan and engage. So you really got to design. You try and design the process from end to end. My own experience with policy is nothing ever goes to plan, but having the plan is the important thing. And then you have and you think about, as part of that, you think about the engagement with stakeholders, and then you step yourself through the analysis stage, the detailed design, thinking about the design of the operation, and then your learning strategy. So it's a step-by-step process. And thinking about engagement is a really useful tool in the toolkit. And so within the toolkit, we've got a series of sort of focus questions that ask yourself, and you'll see at the bottom there's a little, the resources are available. So there's both academic sources, there's practitioner guides, and there's practical examples and and case studies. So the toolkit gives you the tools to work your way through a set of choices. And if thinking about your engagement process, there's a little toolkit there, which is from the World Bank, and it's just about being very deliberative about where you are on the continuum in terms of engagement. Over to you, Jose.
Derek Gill, for explaining this process and in terms of answering the question, where do you start? So, sir, I understand that in the toolkit we have developed, you have proposed or explained to us the different stages of regulatory review. So we would like to know, what is this first stage of this regulatory review that you have defined, outlined in the toolkit, sir?
Yeah, so the first stage, thanks for that. The first stage is about the analysis stage, and you really, you've got to really start at ground zero. And there's a little picture there about a tree, and it has roots. And the idea is you start asking yourself at the really basic level, what's the underlying problem? So you've got to dig down below the symptoms, dig beneath the surface until you hit ground rock. And a good way of doing that is just asking yourself 5 whys. So you just keep so why, and then when you get an answer, why, and you keep digging until you don't get any further. You've got a good problem statement when you've got a clear definition of the underlying issues, and you've got a poor problem statement if it already has a predetermined conclusion. So the problem is that enforcement isn't working well. It's not a problem statement. That's the symptom that you need to start with. And so the problem tree is a really useful way of doing the problem definition stage, which is the key bit of the first stage, which is the analysis phase. So over to you, Jose.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for explaining about identifying options, and of course, with the use of some criteria for the government to do so. So my follow-up question to this explanation you have. By the way, we would like to request our viewers at this point in time, if you have any questions to Sir Derek, you may type in your questions in the chat box, and we'll raise these questions up, and hopefully Sir Derek can give answers or explanation to your questions. So, sir, going back to these options that you mentioned. So you mentioned evaluation of options using criteria. So what sort of criteria and where do they come from in the first place?
Yeah, so there's some good practice principles that have been developed in places like the OECD and APEC and so on. And they're all different, but they're all the same, and they all mention similar things. So proportionality is one. You're making sure that if you've got you don't need a sledgehammer for a small nail. Efficiency, equity, proportionality are all pretty standard criteria that you need to look at. And those are available in the toolkit. Obviously, you tailor them to the nature of the problem that you're dealing with in the context, but there's some general principles that have pretty wide applicability that you can use. And the good thing is, with the toolkit, you don't need to make it up yourself. We've already set them out for you in one place. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So, sir, I have a follow-up question to that, by the way. So we're still waiting for some questions from our viewers. So if there is a case for regulation, as an example, so what is next?
So then you get into detailed design. So that's the next stage in your process. And there's a number of aspects you've got to think about in the detailed design. So they're all listed there. There's 9 of them. So I won't, obviously, as we don't have another 3 hours, I won't go through all of them. But you need to be thinking about all of those things. And you obviously need a mix of skills in the team if you're going to be able to address all of those. You need people that understand compliance, people that understand organizational design. You need lawyers because you need to think about legal powers. But using a simple, using one of those examples, we'll just take the cross-border one, because a number of people in the region are in ASEAN, and with ASEAN's economic integration and ASEAN 2025, cross-border stuff's really important. Similarly in New Zealand, our relationship between New Zealand and Australia is really, really close. So cross-border issues are pretty fundamental in regulatory reform these days. And so there's some focus questions out of the toolkit about, what the provisions are in international agreements, but you also need to think about interoperability and, how are we going to, if we've got nationals practicing offshore or offshore nationals practicing in New Zealand, as we do with Australia in a lot of areas, how's the regime going to apply to them? So there's a range of international cross-border issues you've got to factor in. Yes, so if you've got any more questions along those lines.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me go back, because I believe your explanation used one example, which is the cross-border issue. So let me go back to your 9 steps, basically. So you explained about cross-border issue, and there are other factors there, or I would say the different phases. So actually, out of these 9 steps in the phase, so which are the most important, do you think, based on your experience? I know you have done a lot of work on regulatory review with OECD member countries, or even in the ASEAN countries, or even with the APO when we engage you in the past. So maybe we could ask your view, your experience so far, or which of these steps are the most important?
Well, they're kind of the perfect answer is, well, they're all important, because if you get any one of them wrong, then the design may not work, or certainly won't work according to plan. I guess in my own experience as a practitioner, it's the change management that's the most important. It's the soft stuff. The hard stuff's the easy stuff. It's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. It's the stakeholder management. It's taking people with you. It's getting politicians based on board, and then keeping them on board as you go through the change process. That's where most reforms succeed or fail, regardless of the design. So you can have the most perfect design, but if you don't execute on the change management dimensions, then the design will fall over, because you've got to take people and stakeholders with you. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I know for each phase, you can elaborate more. I think you have done a lot of work, especially in terms of practice of this regulatory review. And now let me bring the discussion to enforcement. I think this is very important. So it's not just enough that we develop those regulations, we review them, but critical to this regulation is about enforcement. So I know in the toolkit, you also explain this enforcement. So my basic question is, where does enforcement come in?
Yeah, so you've got to think really hard, and when you're designing the regime, about what tools you're going to need for your enforcement regime. And a really good model for thinking about that is ears and breaks compliance model. You'll find this on enforcement agencies' websites around the world. There's different variants of this, but they all basically say the same thing. And it's really, what it brings out is, on the left-hand side, you've got different sorts of interlocutors or regulators that you're going to be working with. So you've got, you want to have as many people as possibly willingly doing the right thing, so you don't need to enforce it all. And then you've got your muddled non-compliers who will do the right thing when prompted, but may need a bit of prompting. But obviously you don't hit them with a big hammer, because you want them to voluntarily comply and start behaving like the people at the bottom. And then at the very top, you've got your recalcitrant non-suppliers, and no matter how nice and pleasant you are to them, they're never going to comply unless you hit them with a stick or threaten to. So you need to make sure that you've got all the tools in your armory, which is the things on the right-hand side, and all the elements of the compliance strategies in place. So the ears and Braithwaite, the compliance pyramid's a really nice tool for thinking about kind of if you're a musician, which you want all the keys on the piano so that you can play the tune that you need for the regular disease you're dealing with, because people are different, and you don't treat them all the same. Does that answer your question on compliance? It's a field on its own, and I'm not a compliance expert, but I have thought about the design of compliance regimes. But any questions from you on that, Jose?
Thank you very much, Sir Derek. Actually, I have something in mind, as you explained, because actually, in my experience, when it comes to supporting government, especially those involved in regulation, so sometimes enforcement work and sometimes enforcement doesn't work. But anyway, sir, thank you very much for bringing us this model, the IRS and Brathwaite. So we believe that there are a number of approaches that have been built on this model that you have just explained to us, the IRS and Brathwaite. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So including smart regulation, really responsive regulation, and risk-based regulation. So from these different approaches, in your own views, so which one do you recommend, or at least in this toolkit, which one is the one that you highlighted most?
And in the toolkit, I covered them all, and that's because I wouldn't be doctrinaire about this one right regime, one right approach. It will depend a lot upon the nature of the domain that you're regulating in. A risk-based approach is fine, but that means you've got to be in some domains, but that means you've got to be prepared to live with some things going wrong. A risk-based approach won't achieve absolute consistent results. It will result in some adverse results. And if that's relatively, if the consequences of that are not too serious, then that will work fine. If human life is going to suffer as a result, you may want to consider other approaches. So I think you've just got to, again, it's what the toolkit's about is pointing you to the choices, and so that you can make a more informed choice. But which approach will work, both given the nature of the domain and also the capabilities of the regulatory agency and the capabilities of the regulatees, of the citizens and businesses that you're working with. Hopefully that gets to your question. I've answered it by saying I wouldn't choose one. I would make a deliberative choice between them all.
All right. Yeah. So I think it will be up to our viewers and all those researchers or those who are in the enforcement agency to look into this toolkit to understand more your explanation on the different topics that using this model that you have explained in terms of what is a smart regulation, or how to develop a smart regulation, or really responsive regulation, or how to make sure that regulation is a risk-based regulation one. So, sir, thank you very much. So, yeah, I believe that whether regulation is successful or a failure one, yeah, I think there's always an opportunity for improvement. And basically, we talk about continuous learning, especially for a particular regime or particular agency, or in that particular stakeholders involved in that regulation. So my follow-up question is, why this continuous learning important for a regulatory regime in the first place?
Quite fundamental in regulation, because you've got fundamental uncertainty about how regulatory regimes will work in practice. No reform that I've been involved in, and it's quite a few, I've got grey hair, has ever gone the way rolled out the way we anticipated it. It's unleashed dynamics. You can almost think about regulations as experiments. And so you don't know quite how it's, you can have some priors, but you're not going to know for sure. So you need to be across how it's evolving. And there's a number of ways you can do that. So one is monitoring the regime's operation. So you develop a bit of a dashboard, and you gather some information from regulatees, and you work out some performance metrics, and you keep an eye on those. That tells you something about the immediate uptake of the regime, but not necessarily about its impact. So then you most probably want a commission of some sort of evaluation So that's your second tool. So an evaluation looks at the regime's effectiveness, either in terms of the process, how it's been executed, or in terms of its impact. Is it having the desired effect, or is it having an undesired effect? And after it's been in operation for a number of years, it's always good practice to build in a review. You can even build in the provision for a review into the legislation if you're establishing the regime by law, so that after, say, 5 years, the regime will be reviewed, and you trigger review and you bring in a thoughtful outsider to run the review process would be my advice. Underpinning that, you've got to be really clear about why you're regulating. And so the next slide, it looks kind of busy, but what it's bringing out is the blue boxes. What are we trying to achieve, which is the first box? What's the regulation of interest trying to achieve? And then what do we want people to do? And that's both the regulators themselves. What do we want frontline staff to do, frontline operatives? And how do we want citizens and businesses to behave? And then what will actually happen? And those play out over time and space. So what that diagram brings out is you get impacts and intermediate impacts and final impacts, and they play out over time. So what an evaluation and a review is looking at is, did you achieve your intermediate outcomes and your final outcomes, and were there any perverse or unexpected effects that come through? And these intervention logics, these theories of change, give you a structured way of thinking about that. And you should have one of these when you're designing the regime, so that when you come to evaluate it after it's been in place for a while, you are really clear about what you're trying to achieve. So your learning approach needs to be built into your design of the regime before it's operational, not tacked in the end once it's been in place. You need to be thinking about your learning strategy as part of your policy process, so that the learning steps and skills and resources and capabilities are built into the model as you go forward. Hopefully that speaks to your question. It was a long answer, but it's a big field, and it's also the area, to be clear, it's the area, if you look at the OECD surveys of regulatory effectiveness, it's the area that all OECD economies struggle with. New Zealand's no exception. So it's an area where all countries have got to try harder.
All right, sir. Thank you very much for. It's a very good, diagram to understand better on the intervention logic, as you explained. So the interventions, actions, and outcomes, and you have explained the 3 key steps on how to ensure that this capacity or continuous learning, I would say, should be undertaken continuously by a particular regime. So you highlighted the monitoring, the evaluation, and review. So, sir, I want to jump into another issue of in this conversation with you. And I know you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have experience with different OECD countries. So there is a kind of, an expression, set and forget. So set and forget is a big problem for regulation. And it shows that in OECD data suggests that even developed countries, there are some examples struggle with learning about regulatory performance. So based on your experience with OECD countries' experience, I would say, what is your advice?
Yeah, I mean, all countries are different, but they're all the same. So they're all different in the sense that they've got different constitutional arrangements, they've got different capabilities, they face different imperatives, different constitutional systems. But they're all the same in the sense that we're all making the same regulatory choices. The toolkit's the same across all countries. We've got similar options of what we can do. And so what the toolkit's trying to do is just make those choices more informed, and people consciously think about a wider range of options than their standard operating procedures might have thrown up. So and building in the learning, your learning strategy is a crucial part of your upfront design of any or redesign of any regulatory regime. You can't add it in afterwards. You've got to have thought about at the beginning how you're going to monitor, how you're going to evaluate, and when you're going to review. build that in so that you've got a clear theory of change, you're gathering the information as you go, so that when you hit the review step, you're hitting the ground running, you're not starting from scratch. But this is a race without a finish line. No country is an exemplar in this area. All countries all regulatory agencies have got to work hard at this. There's no silver bullets. There's no best practice. There's just good practices to aspire to.
All right, thank you, sir. So
Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think this is a really big issue, and so hopefully we can learn from those countries when they set and forget this aspect when it comes to I would say continuing effective regulation. Of course, there are more examples out there, especially those countries that have experienced this issue. So, sir, you explained this already, but let me just ask this, at least for a better understanding of our viewers here. So the toolkit concluded with an important comment on the country's context. I think you just mentioned it now. So could you please elaborate on these points?
Sorry, I lost your feed there. Just repeat the question.
So the toolkit concluded with the important comment on the country context. So I think you just also explained that country context will somehow differentiate this regulatory regime and then the effectiveness of any regulatory regime. So could you please elaborate on these points?
Yeah, so you've got different constitutional arrangements. Amongst the viewers of this podcast, they'll come from countries with a dramatic range of capabilities. Some quite sophisticated jurisdictions, some jurisdictions who still are at a more earlier stage of development. So depending upon where you start, you may, faced with a similar problem, you may well make very different choices about the tools that you use. Again, it's the point of the toolkit is to be deliberative in those choices. It's not that there's one best way, one instrument you've got to use for a particular problem. You need to just be conscious that there are different ways of dealing with this, and choose from a wide menu. Don't just narrow yourself down to a very few choices. If you have a hammer, it looks like a nail. When you've got the full regulatory toolkit, and you've got a far wider range of options, and you can tailor your solutions to your context, to the imperative, to the capabilities of both regulators and regulatees. Tailor it to circumstances.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. I think
maybe I'll give it a. Just if there isn't an immediate question, I'll give a New Zealand perspective. So we're, OECD country, regarded as an upper income country. There's a whole lot of areas in regulation where we're starting to struggle to maintain capability. That's why we work much more closely with Australia now, because we're a small upper income country, but regulatory capability is quite stretched in some areas. So New Zealand works really closely with counterparts around New Zealand regulators work really closely with counterparts around the world so that we can learn off others. And sometimes we've got there's some areas where we're regarded as world leaders and we can contribute, and there's other areas where we're fast followers and we learn from others. It's a two-way trade. But over to you.
Thank you very much, Sir Derek. To our viewers, if you have noticed, basically we explain through the Q&A that we have done so far with Sir Derek, the author of this toolkit, the Regulatory Policy Toolkit to Improve Productivity that he developed for the APO. So I believe some viewers now have understood, or at least have an idea on what is this toolkit all about, as the author, Sir Derek, explained. So in case you have any questions later, we can entertain your questions. But I think for this particular P-Talk, so we would like to wrap up the conversation with Sir Derek. So let me conclude the conversation with him in regards to this toolkit that we are promoting in the APO. So we believe that in this conversation, we realize that good practice in reviewing our regulatory regime involves 4 district stages. I think he highlighted that in his early explanation. So we talk about analyze, design and deploy, operate and learn. And Sir Derek kindly explained these stages in his early presentation. So the careful planning of all the stages in this process leads to the institutionalization of good regulatory practices, through which policies result in improvement of productivity and economic performance. Yeah, so as I mentioned, as part of our continuing capacity building initiatives or efforts of the APO for the public sector, the APO hopes that this regulatory policy toolkit to improve productivity will enhance know-how, especially those in the public sector organizations involved with uh, enforcement or regulations, at least their know-how on the key concepts and valuable resources for good regulatory practices that support the long-term public sector productivity and national competitiveness of APO member economies in the region. So I hope that you will find time to look into this toolkit, and hopefully will increase your know-how on this concept of what are these regulatory regimes that will improve your productivity and competitiveness in the long run. So with that, I would like to invite Sir Derek to give his final message, sir.
Yeah, I guess the thing I've been saying, hopefully has come through, is, there's no best practices in this area. There are good practices, and what the toolkit brings out is what those practices are, what the choices are. So it's a resource document. It guides you gives you guides into the academic practitioner literatures, as well as some case studies and examples. And it gives you prompts, questions that to ask yourself. So hopefully it's a useful resource that you can use to make far more informed choices, because they need to be deliberative choices. Designing a good regulatory regime is a worthy challenge, not mission impossible, but it's not a sort of a simple paint by numbers problem. It's a tricky problem. So hopefully, so they can make better choices, and we'd be delighted to hear from them if they got any further questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sir Derek, for thank you very much, Sir Derek, for encouraging our viewers to look into this toolkit. So for our viewers, especially those the first time to join the APO, or maybe first time to hear about the APO, so we will show you on the screen on where to access this material. So hopefully this toolkit, you'll find it useful, and actually you can download it for free. So hopefully this toolkit will help you with your work. So as you can see on the screen, so you may also find, so you can see this toolkit. So right there, the toolkit on regulatory policy to improve productivity. So with that, we would like to thank again Sir Derek, the author himself of this toolkit, for joining us today, and for explaining what one can learn from this toolkit. So hopefully, we encourage you to look into this document. So this P-Talk will hopefully contribute to efforts to understand the importance of well-designed regulations that play important roles in promoting productivity and economic development. So we thank much our viewers for joining us today. So Sir Derek, any final word to our viewers, sir, before we close this P-Talk today?
I trust people will access the document, and feel free to contact APO or myself at Victoria University if they have any follow-up questions. We'd be delighted to help them move the way forward.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
You.
Actually, Sir Derek, you can also keep in touch or contact him in case you have questions with regards to this toolkit. So our viewers, please tune in to our upcoming P-Talk to learn about different topics that affect the productivity of individuals, organizations, and economies as a whole. So with that, we'd like to thank you again for joining us today, and please stay safe, and goodbye for now.